Formerly a significant piece of the San Francisco waterfront, the Embarcadero Freeway was spawned from the exponential rise of American car culture during the 1950s and 60s, where in order to satisfy the meteoric increase of car ownership, all other aspects were forced to take a back seat so as to allow the automobile to thrive, the freeway being perhaps the pinnacle of this somewhat flawed philosophy. As for decades, it obscured one of the most iconic harbor buildings in the world with a two-level concrete overpass, its removal eventually being owed to an act of nature that forced the domination of concrete out and the open air back in. The area in which the freeway would be built is the Embarcadero, the historic harbor area of San Francisco that lines the eastern waterfront of the city facing San Francisco Bay, and stretches for 3 miles along an area reclaimed over several decades from the frigid waters by numerous seawalls, so as to create an easily accessible port for ships bound for destinations across the Pacific. San Francisco Bay rapidly becoming one of America's major trade centers, with multiple large port facilities in Oakland, San Jose, and San Francisco itself, thanks to its deep water nature and sheltered conditions from the turbulent Pacific Ocean. While the Embarcadero has many notable and historic landmarks along its length, including former piers repurposed for tourist and recreational uses such as Pier 39 and Fisherman's Wharf, its most iconic facet is the Ferry Building of 1898, a grand terminal building used by passengers wishing to access trans-bay ferry services across the San Francisco Bay in a time before the bridges and tunnels, the Ferry Building being used by regular commuters traveling to Alameda, Marin County, and Oakland on the opposite side of the bay. The building was also employed by the Southern Pacific, Santa Fe, and Western Pacific Railroads so as to connect the downtown San Francisco area with their stations in Oakland, as well as the Northwestern Pacific Railroad's terminus at Sausalito, the Ferry Building being the product of American architect A. Page Brown, who designed the structure in a classical Beaux-Arts style with a 660-foot-long nave crowned by a 245-foot-tall clock tower, with 4 22-foot diameter clock dials on each face that soars above the end of Market Street, the main thoroughfare through downtown San Francisco. Due to the incredible demand of trans-bay ferry services, the Ferry Building, throughout the early part of the 20th century, was the world's second busiest transit hub behind Charing Cross Station in London, with dozens of individual ferries arriving and departing per hour so as to provide consistent connections across the bay with Oakland, Alameda, Sausalito, and Berkeley. The Ferry Building maintaining its dominance without viable competitors until the 1930s, when after years of planning and development, 2 gigantic suspension bridges would be opened across the bay that would allow buses and cars to travel to and from San Francisco without having to make a lengthy diversion via the southern end of the bay at San Jose. The first was the San Francisco to Oakland Bay Bridge, which opened to traffic on November 12, 1936, and was formed of 2 sections that intersected with the Yerba Buena Island out in the middle of the bay. The Bay Bridge, in its original incarnation, being formed on the San Francisco side by a 4-tower double-deck suspension bridge, and on the Oakland side by a cantilever bridge, and opened 6 months before the Golden Gate Bridge, which connected Marin County with San Francisco at the narrow Golden Gate inlet into the bay, the Golden Gate Bridge being exclusively for road traffic, while the Bay Bridge could additionally accommodate automobile traffic on its upper deck, and trucks, cars, buses, and commuter trains of the Key system on its lower deck. The creation of these 2 new corridors into and out of San Francisco had a devastating effect on ferry-based commuter traffic, and during the post-war era, as car travel rose during the economic boom years of the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Ferry Building was reduced to a shadow of its former self, as ferry services dropped to only a handful of irregular trans-bay operations, while an unsympathetic renovation of the building during 1951 saw the passenger waiting areas inside the Grand Terminal reduced to a single narrow hallway, with the rest of the building being sold off for office space. The immense influence of road travel and the car culture that arose from its arrival completely changed the face of most American cities, as their historic streets and roadways were completely overwhelmed by the massive influx of vehicles now attempting to navigate their ill-suited infrastructure, with an overall reappraisal of the traffic systems within American urban areas having to be made, but this was done in a manner that placed the car traveler first, while pedestrian, cycle, and public transport alternatives came a distant second. During this road construction binge, California, as one of the richest and most influential states in the Union, accounted for perhaps the largest interstate, freeway, and highway output in the country, with the regional centers of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, among others, all drafting plans to have hundreds of miles of 6 to 8 lane carriageways be steamrolled through their urban areas regardless of what stood in the way. In 1948, San Francisco drafted its original outlook during that year's Comprehensive Transport Plan, which proposed that the downtown area be crisscrossed by dozens of individual freeways and highways that ran between the Golden Gate Bridge to the northwest, the Bay Bridge to the southeast, and the newly proposed Interstate 80 and U.S. Highway 101, which would run south along the San Francisco Peninsula towards the airport and eventually San Jose. The first element of this outlined plan was a double-deck concrete freeway that would run up the eastern shore of downtown San Francisco from the Bay Bridge to the Golden Gate Bridge via the then rapidly fading port areas Pacific Heights and the Presidio, all of which, at the time, were considered low-income housing areas of very little economic value. Designated officially as Legislative Route 224, what would become the Embarcadero Freeway would branch off from the approaches to the Bay Bridge at Rincon Hill on a double-deck concrete viaduct, and then turn 180 degrees to the north so as to face the San Francisco Bay again to the southeast of the downtown area, heading northeast to the waterfront, and then turning a sharp left so as to follow the shoreline and pass in front of the Ferry Building. This section also providing a dedicated loop that would give direct bus connections to the Transbay Terminal and on and off ramps leading down to Main and Beale Streets in order to access the city center. The freeway would then continue northwest past the iconic Hyatt Regency San Francisco at Embarcadero Plaza, before coming off the viaduct and running along what is now Broadway via the Broadway Tunnel, before terminating at Van Ness Avenue, with through traffic to the Golden Gate Bridge being directed via the regular inner-city street network to Lombard Street so as to join a new section of highway designated U.S. State Highway 101 towards the Pacific, traveling through the Pacific Heights district of the city to the south of the Palace of Fine Arts and north of the Presidio Historic Fortress, before eventually terminating when it joined the 1936-built Doyle Drive, the original viaduct used to connect the Golden Gate Bridge with Marina Boulevard on the north waterfront, with the direction of travel along the Embarcadero Freeway viaduct being Bay Bridge-bound traffic on the upper deck and Golden Gate-bound traffic on the lower deck. Although local opposition and economic forces had resulted in a general scaling back of the original 1948 plan, by 1955 a new outline plan had been developed which retained not only LR 224 as the Embarcadero Freeway, but would also include the Central Freeway, a similarly built double-deck viaduct that would lead Interstate 80 to the southwest of the downtown area, briefly travel northwest, and then north along Octavia Boulevard and parallel to Van Ness Avenue before terminating at the intersection of LR 224 at Van Ness and Broadway. The overarching intention was to create a freeway loop around the downtown area, with connections north to Marin via the Golden Gate Bridge, east to Oakland via the Bay Bridge, and south towards the airport in San Jose, with consideration also being given to another bridge across the San Francisco Bay known as the Southern Bay Crossing, which would have crossed from Islayes Creek south of downtown to Alameda on a 7-mile bridge, and even had sections of Interstate 280 constructed in preparation to connect with this new structure as part of what would have been the wider Alameda Freeway. However, such a vast plan, which would have torn up large sections of the inner-city area, continued to court stiff opposition from local residents and businesses who were in the path of the proposed freeway and thus facing eviction. Construction of the Embarcadero Freeway, which had commenced during 1957, being halted on numerous occasions by what was known as the Freeway Revolt, in which legal challenges and protests were lodged against the city government that garnered huge support from the general public. The first section of the Embarcadero Freeway, which stretched 1.6 miles from the Bay Bridge to Sansom Street south of Broadway, was opened in 1959 and officially designated Interstate 480, though this would prove to be the only section of the freeway built, as in January of the same year, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, amid the ever-increasing protests, passed Resolution 4559, which banned the construction of certain freeways within the downtown area. This meant that the only elements of the 1955 outline plan to be built were the aforementioned 1.6 miles of the Embarcadero Freeway between the Bay Bridge and Sansom Street, with Broadway remaining unchanged from its original street infrastructure, a widening of Lombard Street from Van Ness Avenue to Doyle Drive to highway standards as part of its upgrading to U.S. State Highway 101, and 1.8 miles of the Central Freeway between Interstate 80 and Turk Street at Jefferson Square Park to the west of the iconic San Francisco City Hall and Civic Center. While the Southern Bay Crossing proposal was axed, alongside intentions to extend the Central Freeway north to meet the Embarcadero Freeway at Broadway, although the possibility to extend the Central Freeway was characterized by a notable stub on the viaduct above McAllister Street, where the extension of the overpass would have continued but never did. However, the passing of Regulation 4559 didn't completely spell the end of a potential expansion of the Embarcadero Freeway between the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge, as during 1964, proposals to lengthen the existing section were made that avoided running through the low-income areas of Russian Hill and Pacific Heights, and would instead see the freeway skirt the north shore of the downtown area at the base of Telegraph Hill, along Bay Street and Marina Boulevard, before connecting directly onto Doyle Drive, this extension being dubbed the Golden Gate Freeway. Once again, though, this plan was shot down by fierce and organized opposition, who considered that the structure would be a blight upon the historic waterfront of San Francisco, with 200,000 people rallying on May 17, 1964, to condemn the scheme, as supported by celebrities including beat poet Kenneth Rexroth and folk singer Malvina Reynolds, a San Francisco native famous for her anti-urban sprawl protest song Little Boxes. This outcry against the extension of the Embarcadero Freeway leading inevitably to the plan being dropped in 1966. Thus, the 1.6-mile section of the freeway that already existed would be the only aspect ever built, the exception being the addition of a new west-facing exit 4 blocks south of Broadway, which flanked the One Maritime Plaza office building, with the off-ramp being routed north onto Washington Street and the on-ramp coming off Clay Street to the south, with this exit being installed in 1965. In the end, while the expansive freeway building spree had been curtailed and large swathes of the downtown area were saved from the wrecking ball, the Embarcadero Freeway remained as a much-hated reminder of the original vision, the structure, which obscured the view of the iconic Ferry Building from the Market Street side, coming to grotesquely symbolize how the transportation tastes of the city had transformed in such a short space of time from the grandiose railroads and ferry systems of yesteryear to the rapidly assembled and unsightly mass-capacity road system of the mid-20th century. The freeway was perhaps the defining example of severance caused by highway construction, as tourists wishing to see the Ferry Building and historic waterfront were forced to navigate the Stygian gloom of a concrete underbelly, now used for the parking of city buses outside the rush hour. These problems exacerbated at the turn of the 1970s, when crime and vice became staples of nearly all major U.S. cities, the Embarcadero Freeway being a common hotspot for muggings, murders, drug dealing, and prostitution rings, who exploited the anonymous shadows as cars passed blissfully overhead, the utopia of suburban living easily accessible by road, riding above a crumbling downtown area now perceived as obsolete to the commuting masses. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, the Embarcadero Freeway remained as a concrete and steel monument to the Eisenhower-era car culture, a brash, unforgiving network of columns, girders, and bridge decks that overwhelmed the San Francisco waterfront, its presence being immortalized in various films and TV shows set in the city by the bay, most notably the Dirty Harry films of 1971 to 1989, all of which, in one form or another, featured the freeway running along the harbor. The image of the viaduct would become inexorably tied to the seedy era of San Francisco's history that films such as the Dirty Harry series perfectly captured, a time when, as its role as a major harbor faced severe decline, the city appeared to be facing a loss of purpose as its main income dwindled and criminal elements moved in to fill the void, though in spite of this perceived decline, calls remained to have the Embarcadero Freeway demolished so as to clear up the clutter and vice that occurred due to its presence. The freeway, considered generally a white elephant as it only formed a small section of the wider highway network it was originally meant to be part of, provided only a minor advantage for traffic traveling from the northern neighborhoods of the downtown area towards the Bay Bridge and Interstate 80 by avoiding the congestion of the city center. Although some voices did speak up in support of the freeway, as in 1986, influential Chinatown community organizer Rose Pak overturned proposals to have the structure removed due to her fear that the Chinatown area of the city would lose a fast crosstown connection. This stay of execution didn't last long, though, as in 1989, the unsustainability of the lightweight, rapidly built San Francisco freeway system was proven to devastating effect during the Loma Prieta earthquake of October 17. When at 5:04 p.m., during the height of rush hour, a 6.9 magnitude earthquake with an epicenter beneath the forest of Nizhine Mark State Park in Santa Cruz, approximately 60 miles south of San Francisco, shook the Bay Area, causing 63 deaths, 757 injuries, and $6 billion worth of damage. A majority of those killed were on the 1950s-era double-deck freeway network, as the tremors resulted in the bridge decks separating from their support columns and subsequently pancaking downward onto the lower decks and streets below, leading to perhaps the most infamous image of the Loma Prieta earthquake, as during the disaster, a 3.2-mile section of the Cypress Freeway in Oakland collapsed, leading to the deaths of 42 people along this stretch of road, while dozens of others were left trapped in their cars beneath the fallen upper deck as rescue workers desperately tried to dig them free. Other damage to the highway infrastructure of San Francisco included a collapsed section of the upper deck on the steel cantilever eastern span of the Bay Bridge, while the Embarcadero Freeway and Central Freeway also saw structural damage, but no reported collapses as a result of the quake. And though this event had caused non-fatal damage to the Embarcadero and Central Freeways, the image of the collapsed Cypress Freeway in Oakland and the subsequent number of deaths led to a terrible loss of confidence in the structural stability of these roadways and their ability to withstand earthquakes. Although the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans, made early motions as to retrofitting and reopening the structure so as to make the bridge strong enough to withstand another tremor, initially at a proposed cost of $15 million, Mayor Art Agnos declared that the freeway be removed and replaced with a wide boulevard and plaza that would free up space outside the Ferry Building. However, demolition of the Embarcadero Freeway was again met with stiff opposition, led as before by Rose Pak, who argued that the freeway still served a vital purpose as a fast crosstown connection to the Chinatown area, with approximately 70,000 vehicles per day traveling along the bridge, 40,000 of which utilized the Main and Beale Streets exit to the south of the Central Business District. Debate as to demolition or restoring the freeway would last well into 1990, eventually coming down to a vote by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, who won a narrow victory in favor of tearing down the Embarcadero Freeway, exacerbated somewhat by the fact that, after over a year of neglect and several thorough studies as to the structural rigidity of the bridge, the original retrofitting estimate as determined by Caltrans had jumped to $69.5 million by the time of the vote. Therefore, on February 27, 1991, demolition work on the bridge began, with Agnos himself taking the first swing of the wrecker's ball against the concrete structure, although his joy at seeing the end of the overpass was short-lived. As for his perceived betrayal of the Chinatown district, Rose Pak lobbied that the local population should not support him in the upcoming elections, thus leading to his defeat on November 5th of the same year against former Chief of Police Frank Jordan, who obtained 52% of the vote. Meanwhile, in 1992, due to damage caused by the Loma Prieta earthquake, the northern section of the Central Freeway to Turk Street, including its notorious stub, were cut back 4,000 feet to its current terminus at Market Street, with the former route of this highway being occupied by either new development or the tree-lined Octavia Boulevard. As for the Embarcadero Freeway, the only initial remnants of the original structure would be at its former interchange onto the western end of the Bay Bridge that lingered until 2005, after which a major retrofitting project saw these last vestiges of this Eisenhower-era highway scheme and symbol of 1950s car culture be removed in stages by 2009, while the original Doyle Drive, as part of a revision to the road network in the vicinity of the Presidio, was replaced with an at-grade diamond junction, and the original 1936 overpasses torn down between 2012 and 2015. Today, what was formerly the route of the Embarcadero Freeway has been replaced by a wide boulevard lined with palm trees, open spaces, and other recreational areas that now reside in front of the unobscured Ferry Building, while the space dedicated to the elevated carriageway has now seen the heritage streetcar E Embarcadero and F Market and Wharves, together with the Muni Metro N Judah and T 3rd Street light rail lines, extended to run along the Embarcadero itself. As for the area of the Washington Street off-ramps, this is now used as Sue Bierman Park, which is named in honor of the former civic leader and member of the San Francisco Planning Commission, who helped lead the charge of the freeway revolt during the 1960s against extending the Embarcadero Freeway north to Doyle Drive, the terminus of the freeway at Broadway now being occupied by the North Park low-income housing block, the kind of which the road would have displaced had the full-scale plans of the 1948, 1955, and 1964 proposals come to fruition. Ultimately, the Embarcadero Freeway was perhaps the perfect incarnation of how car culture was determined to be driven right through the heart of America's urban centers, setting a precedent not just for cities within the United States, but also for many other conurbations in Europe and Asia that place personal transportation and the demands of the motorist over the city's urban fabric and the potential for public transport to provide a sustainable, efficient, and competitive alternative. However, in its rise, the Embarcadero Freeway also came to symbolize the eventual downfall of the era that had been instrumental in its creation, with its perceived urban blight upon the historic waterfront, followed by the impact of the Loma Prieta earthquake, demonstrating that alternatives needed to be sought to replace the rushed, truncated, and often not thought-out designs of the 1950s that had been yoked upon their respective cities, thus leading to its demolition and the opening up of the Embarcadero once again to become one of San Francisco's most wanted public spaces.